Debbie and I are here because we've been chuckling about an article that's from NBC News, and it's called "Bicultural Latinos Embrace Dual Identities, Shun Pressure to Assimilate." And so the underlying premise of the article is that in the old days, Latinos, and I think one could say this about minorities generally, were under pressure to become American, to dissolve their old identity, and to sort of take on this American identity. And now, evidently, and there's a bunch of interviews with different types of people, and we'll talk a little bit about this, what they say, but the idea is that they say, well, we don't have to do that. We can actually preserve our own identity intact. And that's the question I wanted to explore, because it seems to me that even this dichotomy of assimilating versus preserving your identity is misleading. And I wanted to kind of tap into both of our experiences, especially yours. You fit the Latina label. I don't. Talk a little bit about just your own family history. Well, first of all, you have a dual Latina heritage. Talk about that.
I do. So, as most people know by now, I was born in Venezuela to a Venezuelan father and a Mexican-American mother, who is a Texan. She was born and raised in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, down in the very tip of Texas on the border. And so yes, I have two different, basically very different cultures, very different Latino/Hispanic cultures.
Now, well, let's explain what that means, because obviously, by and large, when people think Hispanic, they think this is people who speak Spanish. And yes, your mom and your dad both spoke Spanish, but even then, not exactly the same Spanish, right?
Right. Mm-hmm,
and,
correct.
And second, but Venezuela and the Rio Grande Valley, two different cuisines.
Oh, well, two different worlds apart.
So talk about that. Well, how are those two worlds different?
Very different. Well, first of all, the Mexican culture is quite different than the South American culture, even though they do share the Spain roots. So let me kind of go back to the Hispanic/Latino terms, Latina terms. And I don't even go with this Latinx because that's so dumb. But anyway, Latina, right?
Well, hold on. Since you brought up Latinx, let's just say a word about Latinx. Now, Latinx, quite honestly, we got to be candid about this. Latinx is a coinage of the gays,
Oh.
We know why? Because if you look at Asian or you look at Black, those are gender neutral, right? You can be Black, you can be Black man, Black woman. Asian, the same. But with in the case of Latino, gender. You have Latino and Latina.
Right.
And
so with an O is a dude, ends with an A.
Right. So all these sexual revolutionaries, these trans people, they're like, we can't, there's no distinction between, so we need to put that's where the X comes from. But can you imagine, think about this, how did the gays get to name an entire race?
Well, I don't know. I don't want to talk about that. But anyway.
Okay. Let's return to...
Let's not talk about that. But let's return to this. So basically, the reason that I'm Hispanic and Latina is I am from Latin America, and that's where the term Latina comes from. So let's say a Mexican American from Texas is not typically termed Latino because they're not from Latin America. They have the Hispaniola, Spanish, from Spain, but they don't have the Latin American label, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas since my mother is a Texan, and she always says she's a Texan. She never says she's a Mexican American. That's a whole other story. But anyway, because of that, I'm both Hispanic and Latina.
Now,
yes.
What you're not mentioning, but not because you're holding it back, but because you were focusing on Hispanics, you are also 10% African in your DNA.
Right. I was, yes.
When you got your ancestry, you were a little bit shocked.
Yes. Well, I represent almost every race, if not every race in the world. So I am about as multicultural as you can get.
Right.
This is the face of someone that has 12% African Black roots from Nigeria, from Senegal, from Cameroon, all over, right? And so that's that. And then I also have American Indian, My grandfather was part of the Apache, I guess, tribe. So, well, he wasn't, but his ancestors.
Yeah.
So I have that plus that. Then I have Spanish, Portuguese, Italian. I mean, I'm pretty much everything.
Now, this is worth noting because these percentages of Native American and Black, just talk about those for a second, those are not small because by and large, even in tribal membership, they use a 6% rule.
Okay.
I mean, Elizabeth Warren is far less than, she's got a tiny, tiny percentage, but you qualify by tribal standards as being Native American. If you were chosen to, if you identify as Native American, also, your percentage of Black actually matches many people in this country who are mixed race and who call themselves Black.
Right.
So what we see here, I mean, the reason I mention this is the complete fluidity. If someone tried to classify you, it's not easy to do it.
It's not easy to do.
It's easier to do it for me.
Yeah. Well, you're 100% Indian.
100%.
I'm not 100% anything.
Right.
Right. So I'm a little of this, a little of that. But I want to first focus on my Mexican-American heritage from my mother. So I just want to mention that, and this article basically says that people that grew up Latino or Hispanic wanted to assimilate immediately. My grandmother, who graduated high school, Donna High School in 1927, she was salutatorian of her class, very, very smart. She probably was valedictorian, but there was a lot of discrimination with Hispanics back then.
They didn't want to give her the...
Exactly. And so we think that the reason she got the second, was because of that. But anyway, very smart woman. But she wanted her kids to speak English, to fully assimilate, because she didn't want them to be called out. And back then, when my mother was in elementary school, if they spoke Spanish, they were reprimanded. And so a lot of that stemmed from the fact that they wanted to become fully American, right? So when my mother, after college, my mother went to Venezuela to teach at an oil camp. That is where she met my dad, who was Venezuelan and spoke only Spanish and all of that. So they married, had kids. So I was born in Venezuela. I lived there till the age of 10, spoke only Spanish, did not like English, didn't like the sound it made. I just thought, I just don't like it. I didn't want to learn it. When my parents unfortunately divorced, my mother decided to come back to the Rio Grande Valley to live with her parents. So in I come to Harlingen, and I was speaking only Spanish, but the Spanish that I spoke was very different than the Spanish my mom's family spoke. They had more of a Tex-Mex, and they would have a little bit of a mix of, they would speak English and then they would speak Spanish and then they would mix it up. It drove me nuts. So maybe we'll leave it at this for this segment.
Let's take a pause. But yeah, when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about whether it's possible to be 100% American and at the same time 100% affirm your own ethnic identity. In other words, is the idea of the hyphenated American good or bad? We'll pick this right up.